So I haven't spoken for industry in over 10 years. I haven't served on any industry advisory boards for at least that long as well. So I don't have any conflicts that I'm aware of. So hopefully you don't have to worry about conflict of interest. I'm going to start, see where we are. My tremor with my Parkinson's is not the, yes, that's my problem. It's going to double click on several of them because I can't control it as well. But I'm going to start with an immunization update. There are a few things that have changed with immunizations I'm going to share with you to start with. And the first thing actually came out a little over a year ago in January. Just a couple of things about immunizations and where our guidelines come from. First, you generally need to have an FDA approved or an FDA emergency use authorization for a specific vaccine. So there needs to be the availability of a vaccine first. Then the advisory committee on immunization practices called the ACIP, which is an advisory committee to the CDC, will usually meet, review the information, and make a recommendation on that vaccine or that indication to the CDC. And once the CDC has received the recommendation, they usually follow the advisory committee, but not always. And then it becomes official once it gets published in what's called the MMWR. And the MMWR that's up there is the Morbidity and Mortality Weekly Report. It's a weekly publication by the CDC, and that's where they publish all their guidelines and recommendations. Then it's an official recommendation of the Center for Disease Control and Prevention. So back in January of 22, they updated their recommendations for the Shingrix vaccine. Prior to this time, Shingrix was not FDA approved or recommended for people who were immunocompromised. The old shingles vaccine that was the Zostavax by Merck was a live attenuated vaccine. So it was actually contraindicated in immunocompromised patients because there were the risk that you could actually give the vaccine and create systemic shingles in somebody who got the vaccine if they were immunocompromised. And there were some rare case reports of that. And the reason it's important is because people who are immunocompromised are at much greater risk of developing shingles than people who are not immunocompromised. So you couldn't use the vaccine for this high-risk group because it was a live attenuated vaccine. Now with Shingrix, which is not a live vaccine, it's a vaccine that does not contain any live viral particles at all. We theoretically could use it in immunocompromised patients, but the CDC and the FDA said until we get some data from the manufacturer that shows it's safe and effective in people immunocompromised, it's still not going to be recommended. So now we have that evidence. And based on that evidence, we now have a dosing schedule of 2 doses are still necessary and 2 to 6 months apart. That's still there, except for immunocompromised patients. You can actually shorten the time interval between the 2 doses to 1 to 2 months instead of 2 to 6 months. And that's because if you know the patient is going to be immunocompromised, you can actually give it before and get the 2 doses in before they start whatever therapy is going to cause the immunocompromise. So you can actually shorten it for this population alone, and that's in the new guidelines here. Timing, when possible, should vaccinated before becoming immunocompromised. Otherwise, should consider timing when the immune response is likely to be most robust. So again, that's why we'd rather give it to you before you start an immunotherapy, but if not, it's still okay. It's safe now, and I'll show you the evidence for that in just a minute. So here is some data showing the effects of Shingrix versus placebo on the rate of herpes zoster, shingles, and the various populations based on age on this side over here. So if you look at overall incidence of per 1,000 person years with Shingrix was 30. Incidence per 1,000 person years with the placebo is 94.3. So that's a 68.2% reduction. So that's what they call the efficacy. So it's about 68 to 70% effective at reducing the risk of shingles in people overall in this study. And they break it down by age. You can see there's not much difference in the younger versus the older population. And as we get older, the risk goes up. So again, if they're greater than 50, it's still got almost a 70% reduction in the rate of shingles. Now, again, it's a recombinant adjuvated vaccine, and it's now down to age 18 or older with hematologic malignancies. This is a study that was done where they gave people who had leukemia, and the incidence rate per 1,000 person years was 8.5 versus 66.2, and between the drug and placebo. So it was safe and effective in people who had hematologic malignancies. Come here, back up one more. And this is patients. That's the hematologic malignancies. And this is given the vaccine. There is no recommendation for pregnancy. If you happen to give it to somebody who is pregnant, it's not a problem. They don't recommend it during pregnancy. They'd rather you give it before or after. But if it happens, it's not a big deal. There's no concern. Again, it's not a live vaccine. There's no concern with breastfeeding. And if they've got herpes zoster, they would like you to wait until it clears before you give it. Now, the actual data that we have here is some older data with Zostavax vaccine from our friends at Kaiser Permanente in California. They actually did a study with the old Zostavax vaccine in people who had recently had shingles and give the vaccine. It turns out there's not a whole lot of efficacy in patients who've recently had shingles, because when you have shingles, you've already stimulated your immune system to the max by having had shingles. So it doesn't make a lot of sense to give the vaccine right on top of having an episode of shingles. So what Kaiser's study suggested, you probably need to wait 1 to 2 years after they've had shingles to maximize the benefit of the vaccine. But the CDC says, just wait until the acute stage is over, and then it's safe to give. Doesn't say anything about the efficacy of the vaccine, but having shingles once does reduce your risk, but you can get it multiple times. So there's still a benefit from the vaccine, but I would not give the vaccine, especially during the outbreak of shingles. And ideally, I'd wait 1 to 2 years after they had shingles and they recovered to give the vaccine. We also have data in people who've had bone marrow transplant. That slide got left out of here, but there are also data in patients' bone marrow transplants. It's also safe and effective in those patients as well. So there's not a category of folks who are immunocompromised who you cannot give the vaccine in. So that's the update with the Shingrix vaccine.
Can any issues with insurance covering Shingrix for immunocompromised people?
No. No, not now, since it's in the guidelines. And if you do, all you got to do is refer them to that MMWR from January 22, because those are the official guidelines. And under most insurance companies, if it's a CDC recommended vaccine, it has to be covered. That's pretty much a mandate from the federal government to the insurance companies. They need to cover recommended vaccines. So there shouldn't be much of any pushback now. And again, that's been almost a little over a year ago now. So hopefully most insurance companies, sometimes they lag. They're not familiar with what the updated information is, but that's where we are. This is one that might affect all of us. And this is universal recommendations for hepatitis B vaccine that came out again in April, just about a year ago, of 2022. So now everybody, used to be just selected high-risk groups, but now it's a universal recommendation for the 2 or 3 dose hepatitis B vaccine series with or without the A component. So hepatitis B is now a universal recommendation. And it actually is those 19 to 59. But if you're greater than 60, if you have risk factors like you have diabetes or any of those things, and there's no contraindication to giving it to anybody over age 60, it's just that the recommendations go up to age 60 unless you have risk factors. Okay, so that's new as well. This is the updated recommendation for pneumococcal vaccine. And this is probably the most, not controversial, but most confusing of the recommendations. This has been a moving target that continues to evolve, and it keeps changing. So if you go back probably 7 or 8 years ago, what was recommended for all of us at age 65, 7 or 8 years ago by the CDC? Everybody was a candidate for Prevnar 13. PCV, the conjugated vaccine of the pneumococcal vaccine, which used to be Prevnar 7, then it went to Prevnar 13, and now it's Prevnar 20, right? So we've continued to see they add additional strains to the conjugated vaccine. So Prevnar 13 came along, and it was based on a study out of the Netherlands, where they had patients who had never been immunized with any pneumococcal vaccine. So they weren't using Pneumovax back then in the Netherlands routinely at age 65. And they decided to compare Prevnar 13 to placebo and follow those patients over time. And what they looked at was a number of patients who developed either pneumococcal pneumonia or invasive pneumococcal disease in patients 65 and older post Prevnar 13 versus placebo, and showed that there was a significant reduction in the risk of community-acquired pneumonia and invasive pneumococcal disease in those who got the vaccine. So the CDC said, let's give everybody at age 65 Prevnar 13. But what was also happening with Prevnar 13 at the time, it was still the recommended vaccine for all pediatric patients. So kids all were immunized with Prevnar 13. It went from Prevnar 7 to Prevnar 13. And based on several years of data, the CDC saw that the risk of pneumococcal pneumonia due to the strains in Prevnar 13 for people 65 and older kept going down. And it was, they believed, because we were taking those strains out of the community by immunizing children. So because of the success of the vaccine for kids, it was meeting less pressure on those 13 strains for adults. And we probably don't need to give Prevnar 13 to people 65 and older. So then they came along and said, more recently, that instead of using Prevnar 13, it was still optional. You could still give it if you wanted it, but it was an optional vaccine. But what did they say we should do instead? Give all people at age 65 Pneumovax 23, because it contained 10 additional strains that weren't covered in Prevnar 13. It's not as effective, especially in kids, but it's more strains, and some of those strains we're still seeing in the community. So then we went from Prevnar 13 to Pneumovax 23, and it was still optional if you wanted to add Prevnar 13, because it's not exactly the same strains that are in all these vaccines, and it's a different immune response system with the conjugated vaccine versus the polysaccharide vaccine, which is Pneumovax 23. So now we have Prevnar 20, and we also have Vacnuvance 15 by Merck, which is another conjugated vaccine in addition to Pneumovax 23. So we now have 3 different pneumococcal vaccines on the market in the United States. We have Prevnar 20, we have Vacnuvance 15, which are both conjugated vaccines, and we have Pneumovax 23. So now we have a new recommendation and this is as of January of 22, adults 65 and older who have not previously received PCV. That would have been PCV 13, 13, Prevnar 13. If they had not received Prevnar 13, then they should receive either Vacnavance PCV 15 or PCV 20, Prevnar 20. But if they get Vacnavance PCV 15, they should also get a dose of Pneumovax 23 a year later. If they get PCV 20, Prevnar 20, they don't need a dose of Pneumovax 23. That's the current guideline. See where you can get confused? And it depends on what you've had in the past. And if you don't know, then don't worry about it. Go ahead and use this guideline. If patients don't know and you don't know whether they've been vaccinated with one of the new pneumococcal vaccines or PCV 13 in the past, doesn't matter. Go ahead and give them either Vacnavance 15 followed a year later by Pneumovax 23 or Prevnar 20. Okay, that's the new current guideline. But stay tuned, because both Merck and Pfizer are going to bring out new vaccines, hopefully later this year. They're going to increase those strains even more. So they will replace Vacnavance 15 and Prevnar 20. So in the next year, we're likely to have two new vaccines by both manufacturers that are going to replace those. And I don't know what's going to happen to Pneumovax 23 once we get more strains of the pneumococcal covered in the newer conjugate vaccines to come. So it's a moving target. It's confusing. I would encourage you to download. This is free on the CDC website, MMWR, and you can go there and download this guideline of what to do. Now, they say when PCV 15 is used, the recommended interval between PCV 15 and PPSV 23 is greater than or equal to 1 year. But a minimum interval of 8 weeks can be considered for adults with immunocompromising condition. So the reason for the 1 year is back to our friends at CMS, Medicare, and Medicaid, but Medicare mainly. And it turns out CMS will not pay for two different pneumococcal vaccines unless the claims are submitted at least 11 months apart. So the CDC has said, we'll say 1 year. So it's 1 year or greater between the two doses. But 8 weeks is the minimum. If you give the conjugated vaccine first, you can give the polysaccharide vaccine, Pneumovax 23, 8 weeks later. That's the shortest interval. But in general, it's a year because of coverage. Medicare will not pay for the two vaccines unless they're submitted at least 11 months apart. It's not a clinical reason, it's a coverage reason only. Again, more confusing, but that's where we are, okay? So that's the biggest change. If they've already had PCV 23, which was the current guidelines until last January, everybody at age 65, you could optionally give PCV 20, but you could now give, the recommendation was Pneumovax 23, then they are still a candidate for either Vacnavance or Prevnar 20. So if they've not had any conjugated vaccine as an adult, they still need one dose of one of those, whether they've had PPSV 23 or not, but it should be at least a year later. Okay, 1 year after Pneumovax 23. So we went from Prevnar 13 to Pneumovax 23, and now we're back to Prevnar 20 or Vacnavance 15 plus Pneumovax 23. And it's going to change again in the next year, we think. Okay. Here's a list of the conditions where you want to give either Vacnavance 15 followed by Pneumovax 23 or Prevnar 13 if they are less than 65 years of age. That whole list here, alcoholism, chronic heart disease, chronic liver disease, chronic lung disease, cigarette smoker, diabetes, cochlear implant, congenital acquired asplenia, so your sickle cell patients, sickle cell disease, chronic renal failure, all those things, HIV and leukemia and all the malignancies, those are all candidates to get the vaccine at age 19 or above. But once they've had a dose of the conjugated vaccine, either Prevnar 20 or Vacnavance 15, they don't get another dose at age 65. So if you give it before age 65, there's no second dose required of one of the two conjugated vaccines. Now, if they were only getting PPSV 23, Pneumovax, there are second or third doses of those 5 years apart because it's not as effective and not as long acting. But again, that doesn't come into play with your conjugated vaccine, especially PCV 20. There's no need for Pneumovax on top of Prevnar 20. But if you give Vacnavance 15, followed a year later by Pneumovax 23, you could make a case to give another dose of Pneumovax 23 5 years later, because again, it doesn't last as long. And the maximum number of doses that we have for that as an adult would be 3, at least 5 years apart. So this is, again, a moving target, but this is the current recommendation. So they voted unanimously to recommend Vacnavance for children now. So Vacnavance, which is PCV 15, can replace Prevnar 13 for kids as the primary pediatric immunization. Prevnar 20 does not yet have that indication. So this is new for Vacnavance 15. And these kids, if they get it, do not need Pneumovax 23. So this is the one-time Vacnavance is given without Pneumovax. Again, it's a complicated system. So the immune system is greater with this one, and that's why it's recommended rather than Pneumovax 23. And stay tuned, later this year, Prevnar 20 will also be approved for pediatric patients. That study is complete. It's been submitted to the FDA, submitted to the CDC. So it's just a matter of time until both these conjugated vaccines be approved for pediatric patients as well as adults, and later will be replaced by 2 additional vaccines that are in the pipeline right now. So this is the slide from MMWR this year that ACIP recommended 15-valent pneumococcal vaccine as an option for pneumococcal vaccination in children. So this was their slide, and this will be updated with PCV 20 in the near future as well. But this was their recommendation. They don't have a preference for Prevnar 13 versus Vacnavance 15, one or the other. And we don't know what they'll do once we get the approval for PCV 20. But I can tell you that PCV 13, Prevnar 13, will go off the market once we get an FDA approval for Prevnar 20 for pediatric patients, because there's no more indication for adults for Prevnar 13. The only indication left is pediatrics, and this is now, you can see, recommends as an option, but 13 will no longer be available. Just like PCV 7, Prevnar 7 went off the market when we got 13. Once we get the full indication list, Prevnar 13 will also go bye-bye. But if they've had Prevnar 13, there is no recommendation to replace it or give an additional dose of either the Vacnavance 15 or Prevnar 20. So this is the update that's coming, and it will be supposedly this month will be the decision, but I haven't seen it yet. So we should see data very quickly on Prevnar 20 for pediatric patients. The study's complete, it works, and there's no reason. The FDA has fast-tracked it and given it breakthrough therapy status. So we'll see what happens here in the next couple of weeks. This is a change that affects many of us that went into effect for this past flu season. This is the only major change with flu vaccine for older adults. This is the 65 and older population. In the past, the CDC did not give you a preferred flu vaccine to use in those of us who are chronologically gifted. They gave us an option to use whichever flu vaccine was there. And the only one that wasn't approved for people 65 and older was the nasal flu vaccine. Flu mist was not approved for older adults, but all the others could be used. And we had two that were specifically indicated in their label for those 65 and older. What are the two that were labeled 65 and older? High dose flu vaccine, Fluzone high dose, which is 4 times more concentrated than regular Fluzone. And it's only indicated at 65 and above. And the other one is Fluad, that was adjuvant added with squalene oil added to the flu vaccine. So Fluad and high-dose Fluzone were the two that were FDA approved for 65 and older, but the CDC did not have a preference for using those in people 65 and older until last fall. And for the first time, they actually give us several flu vaccines that we should prefer in those 65 and older. And it was unanimous vote by the advisory committee on immunization practices to the CDC, and it's in the guidelines now. 65 and older should receive high-dose inactivated flu vaccine. That's Fluzone high dose. It's the only high-dose one we have. Adjuvant flu vaccine, and that is Fluad, or recombinant influenza vaccine, which is Flublok. So either Flublok, high-dose Fluzone, or Fluad were recommended for the first time as preferred by the CDC for people 65 and older. And the only one we have good data on is the high-dose Fluzone, where we have a study showing it's superior with the old trivalent. It's not the current vaccine, which is quadrivalent, 2A and 2B strains, but that study actually showed the number needed to treat to show better efficacy with the high dose versus regular Fluzone was 218. So of every 218 patients treated with a high dose versus regular, there was one less documented case of influenza due to one of the strains that was in the vaccine. So that's where the evidence is, but now we have 3 that are recommended specifically by the CDC. And what do you know about Flublok? There's 2 things you need to know about Flublok. It's a little different. It's made in the fall armyworm, recombinant DNA. It has no egg from start to finish. It's not made in egg cell culture anywhere along the way. So theoretically, the CDC doesn't say you can't use any of the vaccines in people with egg allergy, but if you really want to get down to it, the only vaccines that have no egg anywhere in the process, Flublok is it. Okay? So that might be a niche for that one. The other thing about Flublok that's different from the other vaccines, Flublok has got a 6-month expiration from the time it's manufactured. All the other flu vaccines have a universal expiration date. They expire the end of June. So the end of this June, all the flu vaccines that we've had since last fall will expire by June of 2023. Flublok is 6 months from its manufacture. So it's got a shorter expiration date. You need to look at Flublok's expiration. All the others are universal expiration dates. So that's the 2 pieces that I think with Flublok that you might want to look at. Andy? What's going on? Stop screen. Andy, what do we need to do? It's magic. I don't know. Stop screen sharing.
This is usually the part where we go, oh, this is a good time to take a break.
Well, you can. Why don't we do that? Why don't you go ahead and refill? We still got food out for another 15 minutes. So go ahead and refresh your coffee. And once we get back here. Yeah.
Food or not food, but pneumonia deaths, things like that, that could be related to people that have gotten the COVID vaccine.
Not aware of any relationship. The COVID vaccine has been shown to actually reduce your risk of dying from pneumonia and those kind of things, because if you get COVID, you get a secondary bacterial infection that can lead to pneumonia and bad outcomes. And if you don't get COVID, then that reduces your risk of the other bacterial infections causing pneumonia and bad outcomes. So the data is actually in the other direction.
Programming your cells to make the spike protein, and that you would have an increase in mucus or something like that.
We've not seen any of that. No, the hospitalization rates, the mortality rates, everything are down significantly if you get the COVID vaccine versus not. And I'm going to show you some new data here. Recently, the old COVID vaccine is now no longer approved as of the last 2 weeks. It's over. Yep, they've taken it away. The FDA has stopped it, and the CDC's advisory committee has recommended against continuing to use the old monovalent vaccines of the messenger RNA vaccines, either the Pfizer or Moderna vaccines, and replace it with the bivalent. So all new doses are going to be bivalent, even if it's a new start. Somebody hadn't received any doses in the past, we're going to use the bivalent vaccine now. So stay tuned. I'll show you that. That's the slide I've added that wasn't in your original slide deck you got. No, you're good. I'm glad we got a techie around, because I would be totally lost. Anybody have any other questions while we're where we are? Yes.
You've had the Prevnar 13 and the Pneumovax 23. You know you've had it. Can you also go ahead and take the 20?
It won't hurt you, but there's no recommendation to do so. Again, would have to be at least a year after the Pneumovax 23 is the only issue.
So it's not recommended.
It's not recommended. That's what I've had. I've had Prevnar 13 and Pneumovax 23. I've not had Prevnar 20 or Vactivance 15. We good?
Slide 15, I think you were on, or is it 16?
Yeah, this is good. This is good. Thank you, Andy.
You're welcome, Mike.
I don't know what I'm doing. That's not my job. It's above my pay grade. Yes. And again, I'd probably wait, because within the next year, you're going to have new vaccines that are going to have even more strains in them. Okay. So just to let you know, that's coming very, very soon for both Merck and Pfizer. Both of them are coming with new vaccines. So how many of you used this recommendation for your patients 65 and older this past year? Good. I'm glad some of you did, but now you all know about it. So next year, again, when we get it, we're anticipating what we're going to see is people 65 and older should get one of these three specific vaccines because they're more effective in people 65 and older. Because what happens to our immune system as we get older? It gets less responsive to vaccines. So the high dose gives you 4 times more of the antigen that's in the regular flu zone. The flu add gives you an adjuvant to stimulate the immune system in addition to those strains. And flu block is maybe a little more immunogenic because it's not made in egg cell culture, although I don't know that we have really good evidence for that one. The other two, I know we have some evidence, especially the high dose. So I personally get the high dose vaccine every year. Yeah.
Are there any head-to-head studies between the flu zone high dose and the flu add? I have patients ask if the flu add is really high dose.
It's not high dose. And I have to admit to you that 2 years ago during COVID, our university didn't have the high dose. So I went to a grocery store pharmacy chain that said they had it. And it was one of my former students who was the pharmacist who gave me, and I said, I want the high dose vaccine. And she said, sure, no problem. So my wife and I got it, and then she gave me the paperwork. And the paperwork said, we got flu add, not flu zone high dose. And flu add is not high dose. It's the same amount as the other vaccine, but it's got the adjuvant in it instead. So it's not a big deal, but it's not high dose. Flu block is not high dose. So if somebody says they want the high dose, there's only one high dose vaccine, and that's flu zone high dose. No, I didn't get enough, although it wouldn't have hurt. I have a good friend who's an infectious disease specialist who works with the state, and his wife is an immunization specialist. And he says, Wayne, I get a dose early when it first comes out. And I personally wait till October, the end of October. Halloween's my target date for me to get my flu shot because they don't last a whole lot of time. You could actually run out if you get it in September, you could actually run out in January where it's not so effective anymore and still get the flu. So I wait until October, the end of October, to get me through the high risk flu period. So what he does, he gets his second dose in January when his first dose is not going to be very effective. And if we still have some left at this time of the year, he gets the third dose in June before they expire. That's what he does. I don't recommend that. It's not in the guidelines, but there's no harm in it. Okay? It doesn't hurt to get an additional dose of the influenza vaccine. Okay?
The flu zone high dose last season was $10 more per dose cost in the flu add, and of course the reimbursement was the same.
Yes. Yep, I'm sure that's why they did it. It's all about the dollars. But when you go in and you say you've got the high dose, it is not, flu add is not high dose. But it's the only one to have an adjuvant added to it to stimulate the immune system from a different mechanism.
But there's no.
And there's no comparison. The only one that has outcome data is high dose flu zone. And it's not the current vaccine, it's the old vaccine that was trivalent. That's the only trial we have versus placebo showing what happens to your risk of developing pneumonia and invasive pneumococcal disease. So there's only one trial that's ever done that. The rest of them are just showing what the immune system does. So it's the immune response is what they report, and that's what the FDA and the CDC is basing their recommendations on, not based on outcome data, sorry to say. All right, does that make sense? This is the 2022-23 efficacy according to the CDC. Hospitalization from flu are continuing to climb dangerous levels, likely due to low vaccination rates or people choosing not to mask or to stay at home when they're feeling sick. So we still have a problem with not only COVID, but also influenza, and people have gotten away from getting immunizations right now. So there's a lot of folks that are behind in all their immunizations, including kids. Because during COVID, a lot of the old immunization recommendations kind of fell by the wayside. People decided not to go into the office, not to be immunized. So we need to catch some people up with immunizations. It's the number one thing that's been most effective in the last 100+ years to slow the rate of or reduce the rate of major infectious diseases and bad outcomes. Immunizations have been game changers. Back up. Update on COVID vaccines. October 20th, 22, the CDC's experts endorsed should be added to the regular immunizations for all children and adults. So right now, as of October, the CDC has added COVID vaccine as a recommended universal immunization. Okay, that's the first time they've added it to all of them for kids and adults. And they voted in favor, which we'll see vaccines becoming part of regular immunizations such as measles, tetanus. Adults and children at 6 months of age are recommended to get. So everybody 6 months and older is now a recommendation to get the COVID vaccine. This has been something that's been of interest. There have been case reports, especially with the Moderna vaccine, which is a higher concentration than the Pfizer vaccine. It's 100 micrograms versus 30 micrograms. So it's almost 3 times higher concentration of the messenger RNA. And that vaccine, based on data from the US and from Canada in particular, appears to have a slightly higher risk of developing myocarditis, pericarditis, inflammation of the pericardium or heart muscle, especially in younger males, adolescent, young adult males. That's where and it's not so much from the first dose, it's the second dose that appears to be most likely to cause it. So the ACIP and CDC determined that the benefit still outweighs the risk. If you expand the interval between the first and second dose to 8 weeks, that appears to reduce the risk. So even though we may have a 3 or 4 week recommended interval between the first and second dose of the old monovalent vaccines, depending on which one you gave, they recommended you might spread it out to 8 weeks to reduce the risk of this complication, especially in young males. So it says that may help some. And people receiving Moderna, Novavax, and Pfizer vaccines, especially males aged 12 to 39, should be made aware of the risk. And these are the symptoms: chest pain, shortness of breath, tachycardia developed after vaccination, particularly in the week after vaccination. About 1 week after vaccination, they come in with these symptoms. And that suggests the good news is it doesn't require specific intervention. It's not got bad outcomes associated with it. It's transient and it's self-limiting. But it has been reported, especially in this population, and more with especially the Moderna vaccine, and separating the doses by at least 8 weeks on the between first and second appears to reduce the risk.
Has been, I've read there's been deaths associated with it for those people that already had underlying health issues.
There's a lot of those issues. We don't know if it's related to the vaccine or not. That's the issue. This is, again, data that looks at the types of cases of myocarditis, and you can see the ages across the bottom, age and years, and you can see that spike on the lower end, and that's the Pfizer BioNTech vaccine. This is a Moderna vaccine, again, a little bit higher down here, but most of the data suggests Moderna is a higher rate than the Pfizer. And here is a myocarditis, pericarditis. This was in JAMA in 2022, looking at the prevalence based on ages. And you can see the age groups that are highest risk here, starting at about age 12 and up, and above 16 and up is where it goes to greater than 1. These are all higher rates here in this slide. And then it goes back down again after that. This is, again, a cohort study in 23 million patients from Scandinavia to include both vaccines. And they said clearly a higher risk of myocarditis after the Moderna vaccine than after the Pfizer vaccine. The group at highest risk, young men ages 16 to 24. Pfizer vaccine shows 5 times higher risk of myocarditis. Moderna vaccine shows a 15 times higher risk of myocarditis. And after seeing this data, people in Sweden decided not to use Moderna in anybody younger than age 30. So again, that's country specific. It's not what we've done, not related to what we've seen the CDC recommend. This is what they did in Sweden based on this information. Oop, come on back here. No, not that I've seen. It would make sense. Yes. Somebody have a question in the back? Let's see. Yeah.
Yeah, I know. They can push it. You struggle with our death rate. And you have a personal opinion on this, or you decide to guide them?
Actually, I encourage people to get it because we still see people die from COVID. We still see people end up in the hospital with need to be on a ventilator. And that is a terrible, terrible thing to experience. And almost every one of those cases is somebody who is not immunized. I have a good friend who's 80 years old. He just tested positive for COVID in the last week. They put him in the hospital and they sent him home the same day because he wasn't that severe. And he's 80 and he's positive for COVID. And he's severely debilitated. But if he had not been immunized, I guarantee you he would not have been sent back home. They admitted him from the ER and they said, "You appear to be fine." They don't see any significant disease from the COVID, even though you just tested positive, and we're going to send you back home, and we don't think you even need Paxlovid. I would have given him Paxlovid personally, but they decided not to in the hospital because he didn't have any major symptoms. And he said, "Well, why did I get immunized?" I said, "You got immunized, Arnold, because if you hadn't been, you might be on a ventilator, or you might not be with us today." Right? So I do think that data is clearly there. This was a change from this year. The FDA and the CDC have both said, we think we need to give the bivalent vaccine instead of the monovalent vaccine, and we don't believe we need the monovalent vaccine anymore. So this was a recommendation to the FDA. And that's what happened recently with the FDA pulling the emergency use authorization for both the monovalent COVID vaccines and messenger RNA vaccine. They didn't pull the emergency use for the Novavax or for the J&J, and means young children and others who haven't been may be eligible to receive the bivalent instead. And it has been signed off on by the FDA. Same thing happened with the CDC working group. This was their February 24th, 23 meeting. And they basically said, the working group wants this transition from the monovalent to the bivalent vaccine. We don't believe we need the monovalent vaccine anymore. So we have 2 different advisory committees, one to the FDA, one to the CDC, saying, we don't think we need the monovalent COVID vaccine anymore. So this is the vaccine data updated as of March the 22nd. People with at least 1 dose of the COVID vaccine, 5+ years, 85.7%. That's pretty good. Fully vaccinated, 5 and above, 73%. But look down here at the bottom where this is patients who've been updated with a bivalent booster. Look at the percentages. less than 20%, except for those 65 and older, then it's 42%. So we have not been very effective at getting people boosted with the bivalent booster. And that bivalent vaccine is much more effective at preventing the Omicron strain and bad outcomes today. And that's why they want us to use only the bivalent vaccine instead of the monovalent for initial therapies now. And I'll show you in just a minute what the recommendations are because they've just come out. So this is relatively new data from the CDC. Effectiveness, first 2 months after adults get updated booster, it appears to be about 50% more effective at preventing hospital or emergency room visits because of COVID-19. 50%. It cuts the risk of going to the ER or to being hospitalized by 50% more than a monovalent vaccine. 50%. And by 4 months, the added protection drops to about 30%. And that's why I'm going to share with you, we now can give a second bivalent booster for those 65 and older. So that's brand new as well. So it's a continuing thing to happen. And what we're likely to see realistically, and this is what I think most of the experts are going to predict, we'll probably see a COVID vaccine that'll be updated annually like the flu vaccine, because of the strains continue to change or evolve. So second bivalent booster pending. FDA is considering 65 and older can get a second shot, and it's permissive as people not directly told to get it. A plan for a fall booster should provide added protection at a time when many would be about a year from the last dose. So we're likely to see that in the future, but we now have the ACIP as of just a week ago. No vote, but members expressed their support for these recommendations that include an additional updated bivalent booster for age 65 and older, and additional doses by those who are immunocompromised. If you're less than 65, monovalent vaccine will no longer be recommended for use in the United States, and the FDA has pulled the emergency use authorization for the monovalent Pfizer and Moderna vaccines. So this is where we are currently. So 65 and older immunocompromised, you can get a second dose of the bivalent booster, even if you've had the full immunization with a monovalent followed by a bivalent booster. Everyone 6 years and older should receive an updated bivalent vaccine, regardless of whether they previously completed the monovalent series. Alternative vaccines remain available for people who will not or cannot receive a messenger RNA vaccine. So you can still get Novavax or J&J, but they are monovalent and they're not as effective as the messenger RNA vaccines. So they're not preferred, but they're still out there for people who cannot get the messenger RNA vaccine. Oop, back up one. Here's the new tables from the emergency use authorization for the bivalent vaccine. These are the new dosing recommendations as of 4/18/2023. So 6 months to 4 years of age, 3 doses, and this is all with the bivalent, okay? Pfizer, BioNTech, this is specifically for the Pfizer vaccine. 3 doses, dose 1 at week 0, dose 2 at 3 weeks, and dose 3 greater than 8 weeks after dose 2. That's for 6 months. And then 5 to 11-year-old, they've already been vaccinated. All they need or not is a single dose, once and done, of the bivalent vaccine. So this is also a change because there's been so much presence of COVID in the community. People have been exposed to it, whether they've been immunized or not. So 1 dose is all that's required. 12 to 64 years of age, 1 dose, just a different amount. And 65 and older, a single dose, and you may give an additional booster dose greater than 4 months after the first dose has been authorized bivalent vaccine for people 65 and older. So that's the new Pfizer recommendation for those who have not been previously vaccinated. Those previously vaccinated, 6 months to 4 years of age, 2 doses instead of 3, 6 months to 4, a single dose, greater than 8 weeks after the second dose of the monovalent vaccine. 6 months to 4 years of age, 3 previous doses, a single dose, at least 2 months after the receipt of the third dose of the monovalent vaccine. Here is again the Pfizer vaccine in those previously vaccinated with 1 or more doses of a monovalent vaccine. They're listed here for you, 65 and older, single dose, greater than 2 months after the monovalent vaccine. And then an additional dose 4 months or greater after that as another booster. Here's the recommendations for the Moderna vaccine, not previously vaccinated. So 6 months to 5 years of age, 2 doses, 1 month apart. 6 to 11, a single dose, even if they've not been previously vaccinated with a monovalent vaccine. 12 to 64, a single dose, and 65 and older, a single dose, and then you can get a booster at least 4 months after the initial dose. So those are not vaccinated previously. Previously vaccinated with Moderna vaccine, single dose, 1 month after receipt of the monovalent vaccine. They have 1 dose if they've had 2 doses, single dose 2 months after receipt of the monovalent Moderna vaccine. Anybody concerned about stroke, MI in patients who've got the bivalent vaccine versus monovalent vaccine? This is a new topic that's come out recently, and online New England Journal of Medicine, March the 29th, we have a study out of France, but in January of this year, the CDC's Vaccine Safety Data Link put out a warning saying possible increased risk of stroke within 21 days after the bivalent vaccine in people 65 of age and older. That came from the CDC. So looking at the evidence, in France, they looked at millions of patients who had received either the monovalent or bivalent vaccine during the last year and found there was no increased risk of stroke, MI, or cardiac. And here's the table that was published in New England Journal of Medicine. So if we look at ischemic stroke, the risk is 0.86, so it's not significantly different. 1 or greater, 1 is no difference. Greater than 1 is a slight increase in risk. Same thing for every one of these. None of these is 1 or greater. They're all slightly less than 1. So it doesn't suggest any association between cardiac events with a bivalent vaccine compared to the monovalent vaccine. So that does not appear to be a major concern. So this should help reassure us that the bivalent vaccine is at least as safe as the monovalent when it comes to these cardiac events, even though the CDC put out that warning in January. The data now suggests it's not a big deal. And this is the reference from New England Journal. That's a link you can check, CleanCard. Novavax vaccine is an adjuvant vaccine, but again, it's not preferred because it's not as effective and it's not bivalent. So while we can use it, it's not going to be used except as an option for those who cannot take or tolerate the recombinant DNA messenger RNA vaccines. Again, more data with it. And in July of 22, the FDA approved it, now available for individuals 18 of age and older. Authorized emergency use as the 2-dose primary series, 2 doses given 3 weeks apart. The Novavax vaccine, but it's less effective, not bivalent, and not a preferred vaccine. October, emergency use authorization, again, as a booster for those 18 and older after the primary series. Again, not bivalent, not preferred. Here we are. Sweden's public health recommended suspending administration of Novavax for those 30 and younger because of the risk of myocarditis. It appeared to be a higher risk with that one as well. So it's not recommended there, but that's not in our concern here. We can still use it. And this is the newest thing that's getting ready to hit us. RSV. RSV vaccines later this year. So this is a major public health issue along with flu and COVID. So is it COVID, flu, or RSV? It's a triple epidemic according to the CDC, with COVID, flu, and RSV cases and hospitalizations rising. All three have similar symptoms, including fever, cough, fatigue. Difficult to determine which one you have. The only way to know is to get tested. You really can't tell by symptoms. Here are the three that the symptoms, there's a lot of overlap between all three, and they all cause significant morbidity and mortality. So RSV, respiratory syncytial virus, we usually think of in kids, and that may be the highest risk group, but it also affects adults, especially those of us who are chronologically gifted. So each year, over 58,000 hospitalizations and 500 deaths in children under 5, as well as 177,000 hospitalizations, 14,000 deaths in adults 65 and older. So this is a big deal too for the same groups that are at risk for influenza and COVID. The risk groups are the same. The symptoms are similar. And we haven't really had a vaccine against RSV, but we're getting ready to have it, okay? Specific treatment, monoclonal antibodies are under development and pending FDA approval, but we don't have a treatment specific for it either right now. This is a slide from the CDC, some fast facts about prepare for parenthood, prepare for RSV, all babies at risk for RSV. Here are the fast facts. It's the most common during the winter virus season, November to March, but can occur in local areas. It's spread when droplets from a cough, sneeze, or infected surface include the eyes, nose, and mouth, just like flu and COVID. 2 out of 3 babies will get RSV by age 1. 2 out of 3 will get it. And RSV can go from a cold symptoms to hospitalization in less than a week. Hospitalization happens only 1 to 2% of RSV cases. It's not predictable which baby will become hospitalized, and babies are 16 times more likely to be hospitalized with RSV than they are with the flu. So RSV is a big thing. So now we have a couple of vaccine candidates that have been submitted to the FDA for RSV. So we're getting another vaccine for another common bad disease. So our Bricebo candidate from Pfizer, licensed through FDA breakthrough therapy designation for infants, seniors, and pregnant women, has accepted their biologic license application for priority review. The action date is May of this year, pending FDA approval. So it's already been submitted to the FDA, and the data's been submitted to the CDC. So that one could be reality later this year. GSK also has a single-dose RSV vaccine candidate, currently conducting a phase 3 study in adults 60 and above. The FDA voted in favor of approval of this vaccine on March the 1st of this year, has set a user fee date of May the 3rd. So we should see this one approved for children in the next month. So we're going to have at least 2 different RSV vaccines approved by the FDA this year, One's going to have an approval just for kids. The other one's likely to have pregnancy and adults in addition to kids. So stay tuned. This is the newest kid coming on the block. There also is one by Moderna. Janssen has one, and Cotovax. So there are a bunch more RSV vaccines in the pipeline. The two that are closest are Pfizer and GSK. Nordic's vaccine candidate is coming. Mesa Vaccines is coming, and Resvax from Novavax is also in the pipeline. So that's at least 8 to 10 RSV vaccines that are in the pipeline right now. And most of them are messenger RNA vaccines. That is the new wave of the future for all vaccines. And the good news is, down the road, there's a plan to combine all these messenger RNA vaccines in one vaccine. Not just 2 or 3, but multiple vaccines in one. So that's in the pipeline as well. This is a biologic license for a monoclonal antibody to treat RSV infection in newborns and infants. So that's in the pipeline. Haven't seen it yet. In these clinical trials, it appears to be effective. The safety profile is similar to placebo. And here is the therapeutic management of mild to moderate COVID-19. So before we move to that, anything about RSV? Yeah.
So if you were an adult and you had RSV 5 years ago, is there any caution as far as?
Nope, there's no concern, just like influenza, just like the COVID, it doesn't mean you don't need the vaccine. So it's going to be a universal recommendation is what I'm going to predict to you. There's going to be none of the studies excluded people who had previously had RSV. And a lot of times we don't know if we've had it or not, because sometimes it's asymptomatic or we don't differentiate it from flu or COVID. And if they're not tested, we don't know what you have. So without testing, we don't know. So it's going to be just like you don't withhold the flu vaccine every year if you get the flu. We still give you the flu vaccine. We don't withhold the COVID vaccine if you've had COVID. We just try not to give it right on top of having had COVID. So when it comes to this, the only drug that we're really worrying about is Paxlovid. Paxlovid is the treatment of choice for patients who have non-hospitalized COVID. And so it's listed as the preferred one, this one right here. And then you can also get IV remdesivir. And the alternative is the Merck drug, but it's not nearly as effective and it's not recommended. It's a last line resort. So Paxlovid is far and away the one that we want to consider using. So this is a Paxlovid, the EPIC-HR trial. It looked at 2,246 non-hospitalized adults age 18 and older with confirmed COVID with increased risk for progression, underwent randomization. So a lot of risk factors. They have underlying diseases, diabetes, asthma, and the like. The main outcome was hospitalization or death by day 28. And you can see the incidence. They had 3 of 389 patients hospitalized who got Paxlovid with 0 deaths, as compared with 7%, 27 of 385 on placebo hospitalized and 7 deaths. So my number need treat is 16 with Paxlovid versus placebo in non-hospitalized adults with COVID. And here are the non-hospitalized adults again, what happened and deaths. So this is just a table of the data. And again, not significantly different than the data I just shared with you. Again, placebo, in graphing it out, the combination with Paxlovid that contains boosted with ritonavir, and that's the culprit that gets us in trouble, the ritonavir boosting.
Do we know if these patients were vaccinated?
This is the reduced risk for hospitalization or death among outpatients in the early setting, yes, it does. And immunity or immune invasive lineages, it doesn't appear to matter. The EPIC 19 SR trial, standard risk instead of the high risk progressing severe disease within 5 days and at least one characteristic underlying medical condition were enrolled and vaccinated. Updated analysis, 57% relative risk reduction with Paxlovid, a 51% reduction in hospitalization and death. So again, Paxlovid is a very effective therapy. Post-exposure trial, and this one did not meet statistical significance. So demonstrated reductions of about 30 to 37% and not statistically significant, but in the right direction. This is for prophylaxis in people exposed, not people who have COVID symptoms or test positive. These are testing negative for COVID. Adverse events. This Guigia or bad taste is number one, which you can see here. You also see the diarrhea about 1% higher, blood pressure is about the same, myalgias maybe a little bit higher, but not statistically different. Anaphylaxis are rare, but have been reported, including toxic epidermal necrolysis, where they slough their skin and look like a burn patient. That's also been reported rarely with Paxlovid. The original emergency use authorization from December of 2021, the dose 300 milligrams of the antiviral, which is 2 of the 150 milligram tablets with 100 milligrams of ritonavir, 1 tablet. It's ritonavir boosted because the antiviral is metabolized by CYP3A4 and ritonavir is a major 3A4 inhibitor. So if you inhibit the metabolism or breakdown of the antiviral, you get higher levels for a longer period of time. So that's why ritonavir is added to it. It's ritonavir boosted to increase the concentration and duration. It's twice a day for 5 days with or without food. There's no dose adjustment for renal impairment. If it's between 30 and 60, those reduced dose if they're on basically less than 60 or less than 30. We also have prescribed individual by a state licensed pharmacist. It's now got a pharmacy can prescribe the drug. So it was not included under all the old original COVID prescribing initially. And the only concern is it's limited because of the drug-drug interactions. And that's significant with this drug. So if there are major drug-drug interactions, we should not be prescribing it in the pharmacy unless we fully evaluate all their therapies. And hopefully they want us to use the primary care provider to review that with. So we need to be in contact with their primary care provider before we prescribe it. Amended in 722, state licensed pharmacists should refer individual patient for clinical evaluation with a physician, advanced nurse practitioner, or physician assistant, any of the following: insufficient information to assess renal and hepatic function, to assess potential drug interactions, modification of other medications as needed as a potential drug-drug interaction. So that's what happened with the change in the emergency use authorization back in July. And just in the last week, the FDA Antimicrobial Advisory Committee voted 16-1 to recommend the FDA give full approval to Paxlovid. That we have data now to prove safety and efficacy, to do away with the emergency use authorization and make it an FDA-approved drug for COVID. And it doesn't matter whether it's the original COVID strain or Omicron, there's good efficacy data with both strains with the drug. So this is something that I believe the FDA will act on fairly quickly because it came from their advisory committee as of April the 24th. So we'll see what the FDA does, but give it full FDA approval and withdraw the emergency use authorization. Under the emergency use authorization, there have been over 10 million courses of Paxlovid dispensed in the United States already, over 10 million doses, full courses, not doses. These are the drug interactions that are listed, and there are many, many. So your 3A4 is the most common drug metabolizing system, and ritonavir is one of the most potent 3A4 inhibitors known to man. If you give simvastatin with ritonavir, you increase the concentration by 30-fold. 10 of simvastatin becomes equivalent to 300 milligrams in the body. It goes through the roof. Okay? So that's contraindicated. You can use atorva, it will go up, but not that high. You can use the BMS drug, you know what I'm talking about. It's the one that Bristol Myers Squibb had. Begins with a P. Pravastatin. Yeah, I'm having a senior moment. Pravastatin is not likely to interact as much. So, but there's just multiple slides in here on the Paxlovid drug interactions and which ones you need to avoid Paxlovid with or stop the drug, or ones that you may need to modify the dose, or it's okay if you just monitor them more closely. So there's just a long, long laundry list, because 3A4 is the #1 drug metabolizing system in the body. So we have to really be careful and watch for these drug-drug interactions. And it's all due to the ritonavir component, not the antiviral. And then, I don't know if you're aware of this website, but if you want to see what you can get, what's available in your location, and this is just South Carolina, these are all the locations you can get Paxlovid. And this was under the emergency use authorization. So this will go away if we get full FDA approval. Okay. But it also shows you where you can get all the other things that we had on the list, including the remdesivir. You can put that in there and it shows you where it's available in your state. So it's state specific, and you can get it down to your city, you can get it down to the local pharmacy level or the clinic level or hospital level. And that's the renal Paxlovid. For those that need a lower dose, it has a special different pack dosing, the regular Paxlovid. And you can see the Merck drug, which is not recommended, is also listed on this one as well, where you can find it and how many doses are available in your state. Let's take a break here, and they've just taken the food away, but we've been going about an hour and a half, so let's take a stand up and stretch break, and we'll come back in about 10 minutes, okay? Yeah.
You know, on the COVID myocarditis
Mhm.
up to 39, what's the explanation that doesn't occur in?
Nobody
One of
seems
those
to know.
things?
We don't know.
Okay.
And it's with the higher dose, because the Moderna vaccine is 3 times more concentrated than the dose is 3 times. It's 100 micrograms instead of 30
Right.
of the spike protein. And if you spread it out by 8 weeks or more, that appears to lower the risk. That's what we know. Go Phillies.
Rick,
Yeah, I was a Philly fan. I grew up in the Philadelphia area.
Anything about Paxlovid and rebound?
It's being studied, but right now there may be a longer course or a second course, but right now does not appear to be very promising.
Yeah, I actually had 2 different people get it.
Mhm.
And actually, wasn't it within Fauci and somebody else? In the
Yes.
group? Yeah.
Yes. Yep.
Hi.
Hey. Oh. Sit down for a minute. It's a beautiful day.
raining in North Carolina.
Yes, raining in Charleston too. We had hail in central Florida yesterday.
Oh, is that right?
Yeah. Down around Melbourne, they had some huge hail. Broke windows and all kinds of stuff. Looked like there was actually a snowstorm in some of the places. It was covered that deep in hail.